Treasure in Paradise by Anna Tikvah. Chapter 1. First Aid. In less than an hour, life in paradise had been drastically altered. 5 tinies were now suffering painful burns in varying degrees, and everyone had been traumatized by the fearful experience. Smoldering ruins stretched across one end of the large terrarium. The very first fire, recklessly lit by Odin Ponce in France, had incinerated many trees in the North Forest near the train tracks. Even with the rainmaker on full power, the fountains around the perimeter spewing water from behind, and the tinies doing their best to douse the flames, it had taken over 40 minutes to fully extinguish the blaze. One courageous fighter, who had labored intensively to quench the inferno, now lay writhing on the ground next to the tiny he had saved. Both were seriously injured. Zahir was groaning, and Ponce was crying loudly. Uncle Louis had fallen beside them, but he wasn't moving at all. Amy and Tina had found the first aid kits in the store and came dashing out to assess the damage and help the wounded. The Beach Boys, who had been on the front lines, were examining their singed limbs. Tina ran in their direction with the burn remedy in her hand, knowing it could only be used for minor injuries. Everyone was wet from the constant rain. 2 dogs were racing around trying to share their love, but for the first time, the tiny who cared most for the animals begged someone to take them away. She was fearful they might inadvertently do more harm than good. Milan took charge of the dogs. With her eyes on the dark-haired young man who was lying on the ground in agony, Amy headed straight for Zahir. He had saved Ponce's life, but after lifting the heavy burning beam, he had tripped and fallen into the flames. She yearned to know the extent of his injuries and to stay by his side. With dismay, she heard his girlfriend Georgia yell from close behind, "I'm looking after Zahir! You go help someone else!" Opening her mouth to protest, the copper-haired girl suddenly noticed that Uncle Louis was in a worse state. Lying motionless, close to Zahir, his eyes were shut and his face was a strange gray color. Crying out with alarm, Amy ran over to kneel by the older man's side. Quickly she determined that he wasn't breathing and he had no pulse. "No, no," she wailed. "Uncle Louis, Uncle Louis!" Suppressing panic, she tried to remember what he had taught her about CPR. She checked that his airway was clear. Placing her hands on his chest in the exact location he had shown her, she began pumping rhythmically. Kenzie and Fahid were right behind her. One look at Uncle Louis's complexion filled them with alarm. "If you get tired," Kenzie implored, "I'll take a turn." Amy glanced briefly upwards and nodded her thanks. Her mind was fully on the task before her. Everything else seemed to blur into the background as she desperately tried to bring Uncle Louis back to life. Although they were only an arm's length away, she barely overheard Kenzie assessing Zahir and Ponce's needs. Completely focused on her task, Kenzie's questions and George's sobs faded in and out of her consciousness. As she breathed 2 breaths into Uncle Louis and watched his chest rise and fall, reproachful cries caught her attention. "Zahir, you look terrible. Your face is black and your skin is peeling. Why did you go into that fire? Ponce started this. He deserved what he got. I begged you to stay out of it because I love you. I love you so much. Oh, what have you done to yourself?" Deep dismay welled up inside as Amy kept pumping. 30 compressions and 2 breaths of air, 30 compressions and 2 breaths of air, over and over. She longed to praise Zahir for his courage, but Uncle Louis was in critical condition. She didn't feel she could stop for even a moment. To her relief, Kenzie spoke up sharply in Zahir's defense. In the office room on the other side of the glass, the professor and Evan were frantically trying to manage the situation. All the visiting scientists had been dismissed and the doors to the viewing hall locked. The tall blonde assistant had responded immediately to the alarm on his phone, dashing through the university halls, through the gardens, and frantically into the rainforest biome. Thinking only of what was best for the tinies, he had been the one to insist that all the scientists and the cameraman leave immediately. Now that the flames were finally out, he pressed the white button to restore the oxygen levels, and then he reached up and turned off the rainmaker. A wild-eyed professor was on the phone with Dr. Farouk Khalid, the best heart surgeon in Greenville. With his eyes desperately focused on Amy's attempt to perform CPR, he anxiously explained the crisis that had enveloped paradise. I think Louis has had a major heart attack, he agonized. We're sending in the train to get him out right away. I have an emergency center set up in the lab, and I'd appreciate any advice you can give me. It also looks like Zahir and Ponzi sustained serious burns. They are lying on the ground, barely moving. I'd say the Beach Boys were injured too, hopefully just minor burns. Responding to Farouk's advice over the phone, Jax called out to Evan. Keep the rainmaker on in that same location. Farouk says we need 20 minutes of cooling rain on the burn patients. Worried about hypothermia, his assistant replied, They've already had 15. At least 5 more, the professor insisted. Then responding to Farouk's inquiry, he said, No, I don't see any evidence of smoke inhalation. The ventilation system worked well. I'd say it was more like putting out a bonfire than trapped inside a burning building. Turning the rainmaker back on, Evan made a call to Rachel Khalid, the head biosphere animal doctor. Explaining the whole situation, he implored her to come immediately. With the phone up to his ear, he listened to her advice as he ran to the train supply room. Placing a small stretcher in the first car, he hastily scribbled instructions to the tinies. Put Uncle Louis on the stretcher, he wrote. Place him on the train carefully, but as fast as you can. Don't worry about the alarms that will go off. Then stay with the burn victims. Elevate Zahir and Ponzi's heads and feet about a finger span. Keep them warm, but don't do anything else until further orders arrive. Don't put anything on their wounds just yet. However, the burn remedy will be effective for the injuries the Beach Boys have sustained. Apply it liberally on them. Hitting the button, he sent the train into paradise with the stretcher and the note. Receiving a text that Rachel had reached the private office door, Evan ran to let her in. Together they peered through the windows, watching Amy's rescue effort and hoping they could get Louis into the emergency bed as soon as possible. Rachel was impressed. She's got the right method, she nodded. Oh, I do hope Louis survives. Glancing at Zahir and Ponzi, she fretted, They look like they're in severe pain. We'll need to assess those burns up close. You mean on this side? Evan clarified anxiously. He knew the professor would only agree to transport tinies out of paradise if it was an absolute necessity. They didn't want to arouse curiosity about the other side. Yes, I mean on this side, she nodded fervently. I'll just run and get some supplies. When the train whirred through the charred landscape and stopped at the store, Fahid ran to it and opened the doors. Kenzie rushed over to help him. Together they pulled out the stretcher and read the note, and then they rushed the stretcher to Uncle Louis. We're to put him on the train, the young man relayed anxiously as Amy continued CPR. Right away, Kenzie pleaded. The girl with the copper-brown hair didn't stop immediately. She gave her unconscious uncle the next breath of air and watched his chest rise. She was oblivious to the impatience of her friends. Everything seemed to be in slow motion. Amy watched Uncle Louis's chest fall. And then it seemed as though it was rising again on its own. Astonished, she placed her hand close to his mouth and felt a slight breath of air. There was no time to take a pulse, as the guys were determined to follow their instructions. As they began to carefully lift the limp, heavy body onto the stretcher, Amy stood up reluctantly. She was certain she saw Uncle Louis breathe again. Once they had his body secure in the stretcher, Kenzie and Vahid grabbed the poles and dashed as quickly as they could to the train. As soon as the precious cargo was on board, the train reversed down the tracks and out through the secure tunnel, with all the alarms blaring. The noise added to the chaos. Picking up Evan's note that Kenzie had left beside her, Amy read it through quickly but carefully. Without Uncle Louis there to guide them through this emergency, Amy felt a fearful loss of direction. Always, in any crisis, the older Tiny had been the steady one they could depend on. She called out Evan's instructions as she read them. I'll get blankets and cushions, Tina yelled, running into the store to grab the supplies that sat on the shelves for trade. Help me, Ponzi wailed. I'm in so much pain. Glancing over, Amy was shocked to see that Georgia was no longer with Zahir. Instead, the young man who had courageously saved another was lying on the ground alone and shivering. Quickly glancing around, Amy saw Georgia bent over the store, vomiting. Zahir, Amy cried, gasping to his side. She dropped to the ground and gazed in horror at his wounds. A bloody blackened patch ran up the side of his face from his beard to the dark hair on his head. Around his neck, the gold chain had heated up in the flames and left a black, charred line. She saw large burns on his right arm and the lower part of his right leg. Trembling, Amy reached over and undid his shining moon necklace, fearful it would rub against the raw wounds and cause more pain. It dropped to the ground. "Are you okay? Are you okay?" she begged anxiously, knowing that he wasn't, but hoping with all of her heart that he would say he was. Shivering uncontrollably, Zahir chattered, "Stay with me. Please, stay with me." Cold rain stopped again, suddenly to Amy's relief. Tina passed her a blanket and 2 cushions and ran to help Poncy. Kenzie came running back over as well. Picking up the cushions, he helped Amy position them under Zahir's head and feet as he encouraged his friend to stay strong. Reaching for the blanket, they spread it over their patient, avoiding his wounds and tucking it under his body where they could. Chilled, dripping wet from the rain, and shivering with shock, Zahir didn't open his eyes, but he did groan appreciatively. Kenzie moved over to help Tina with Poncy. Sitting down, Amy asked, "Are you in terrible pain, Zahir?" She was greatly distraught by the severe injuries she saw. The small burn she'd once sustained from hot glue was nothing in comparison. "So much," Zahir murmured, barely moving his lips. Will I die?" "No!" she exclaimed fervently as her heart skipped a beat. She reached for his left hand and he gripped hers gratefully. "No, we are going to help you. The professor is sending in supplies. You aren't going to die, Zahir." Seeing the extent of the injuries was nauseating, but Amy battled against a reaction. "I'm staying with Zahir," she determined fiercely. "If Georgia can't, I will. He needs a friend. He can't suffer alone." She remembered how much she had longed for someone to stay with her after she had almost drowned. Resolutely, she decided that the 2 most severely injured young men would have her dedicated care. Regardless of what anyone else might say or do, their needs would be her priority. Kenzie came back to rummage in the first aid kit for another tube of burn remedy. Picking it up, he dashed over to the Beach Boys. "You're going to be okay, Zahir," she promised fervently, as tears fell from her eyes. She hoped with all her heart that he would. "You're going to be okay, and I'll stay right beside you." She saw Kenzie, Yu-Yan, and Tina spreading cooling gel on the 3 other young men and elevating their singed limbs. She wished she could do something for the others. Lily felt the same. "What can we do to help?" she wailed, holding tightly to Poncy's hand. Poncy's face had been spared, but his arms and legs looked as badly scorched as Zahir's. Amy assured her friend that instructions would come soon. "Just stay with them," she said. "Don't leave me," Poncy begged. A few of the girls were having the same reaction as Georgia. Unable to stomach the sight of the wounds, Benitha, Santa, Nancy, and Dia were a safe distance away. They looked anxious to help, but reluctant to come any closer. "Play some nice music. Read some books," Amy called out. "Play some nice music. Read some books," Amy called out to the others. "Distract the injured. They are suffering so badly." Happy to find a way to help, Georgia ran to the xylophone, still stationed on the deck of the store, and played music, all the best tunes that she and Zahir had created, and even some more. The xylophone was far enough away that the melodies were soft, not jarring, just a quiet, soothing voice in the distance. Benitha and Santa plucked up the courage to return to their friends. Dia and Charlie had gone to the store to help Nancy make food for dinner, although doubts were voiced that anyone would have an appetite. Holding Zahir's hand with both of hers, Amy praised the injured fighter. "You were so brave," she said, her voice trembling. "You saved Poncy's life. You helped to save Paradise and all of us. I'm going to do my best to help you as soon as I know what that is. We're just waiting to hear from the professor." The large burn on Zahir's right cheek made it painful for him to move his face in any way, but he opened his eyes briefly and whispered, "Thanks." Then he squeezed her hands. "I'm so proud of you, Zahir," she expressed earnestly. "You did the right thing. I wanted to help you, but I was too scared. You had so much courage. I'm so glad you were brave." Looking up, she did a quick check to ensure that everyone was being cared for. Lily was faithfully doing her best to comfort Poncy. Every time he called out in pain, she assured him, "I won't leave you, Poncy. I love you." Tina was helping Damien sit up. Kenzie was applying burn remedy to the blonde surfer's leg, and Vahid was bringing drinks of water to the injured. Franz was propped up against a tree, and Yu-Yan was beside him. Santa had returned to Lima. Milan had locked the dogs in the store and was ensuring the fire was completely out. He doused any stray wisp of smoke. Humming softly to the xylophone music, Amy stayed beside her patient and desperately hoped the train would return. Zahir's eyes were closed, but she could tell from his groans and the occasional intense pressure in his grip that he was struggling to endure. Once again, he asked if his life was in danger, and she tried to assure him that he would be okay. With all her heart, she hoped she was telling the truth. Finally, they heard the train whistle as it came back through the highly secure tunnel. It seemed like it had been gone for ages, but only 10 minutes had passed. After Jax and Rachel had stabilized their living, breathing patient in the emergency care bed and put Louis on oxygen, they ran back up to the Paradise room to look closely at the burn victim's wounds through binoculars. The animal doctor had then phoned her husband, the heart surgeon, who initiated a conference call with the Greenville burn specialist. They had all agreed that severe burns needed proper visual assessment, so 2 stretchers had been put on the train with a second note. It was with great dismay that Amy helped Kenzie and Vahid gently place Zahir on the stretcher. She had promised to stay with him and do her best to help, and now, only minutes later, he was being carted away to the other side. A side that no Tiny had ever returned from. Her heart was full of fear and concern. Lily wailed and begged to go with Ponzi, but the instructions clearly stated that only the 2 most severely burnt victims were to be put on the train. Most of the Tinies gathered around as the train departed again with all the alarms blaring. No one knew what to do or how long it would take before they saw their friends and uncle again. Amy began to cry, and Kenzie put his arm around her. Neither one of them knew what to say. 3 Tinies had just been taken out of Paradise in serious condition. They had all fought a terrible fire, and everyone was exhausted. Wet, weary, anxious, and overwhelmed, they huddled on the store steps, waiting for directions that could take hours to come, and hoping they would see their loved ones again. Chapter 2. The Emergency Response. While the sad little group of Tinies congregated miserably by the store, 3 fully masked, full-sized humans stood around the miniature stretchers. The oxygen levels had been raised in the supply room, since Zahir's facial wounds prohibited anything touching his face. A bright spotlight shone on the 2 burn victims, so bright indeed that they could barely open their eyes. Jax had intentionally chosen an intense light, not only to expose the wounds, but so that Ponzi and Zahir would see as little as possible of those on the other side. On a Zoom conference call, Jax held his phone so that Dr. Mark Montgomery, the Greenville burn specialist, could view the full extent of the injuries. Rachel sedated both patients with a minute amount of painkiller, dropping it into their mouths with the smallest pipette she had. Back at the Greenville hospital, Dr. Montgomery was taking the Zoom call on a giant screen. Observing the wounds, he felt confident the burns were severe 2nd degree and that they would be healable with diligent care. He postulated that the fragile injuries were best treated with tiny hands in the more suitable and sterile environment of Paradise. Rachel weighed both patients and imparted the data to the doctor. She wrote down his precise instructions and cautionary concerns, while Jax and Evan piled the train full of sterile bedding and mattresses, soaps, buckets, and towels, and the 2 bedpans they had in stock for potential emergencies. Caring for the burn victims would require setting up a makeshift hospital. Having keenly observed the various reactions to the latest crisis, Jax was confident that a few of his Tinies were well suited for nursing care. While Rachel's husband, Dr. Farouk Khalid, and the burn specialist tried to calibrate the correct dosages of antibiotics and medications, the train was sent back in with the first load of supplies and the 3rd handwritten note. Eagerly, the Tinies rushed over, hoping to find their friends. But instead, there was only another message and cars full of bedding. Specific directions were listed. Milan, Vahid, and Kenzie, Kenzie read out loud. Take the 7 beds you find on the train and carry them to the girls' mansion on Rainbow Hill. Choose 2 rooms for a caring center. Zahir, Ponzi, and Uncle Louie will need to be in one and the Beach Boys in the other. Take out the girls' beds and set up the new beds. You are then to carry anyone who has been wounded up to the caring center. For the next 3 weeks, Kenzie and Vahid are to remain dedicated to helping the injured, especially during the nights. Take turns during the night shift. Sleep in the same room as Zahir and Ponsi, so you will hear them if they need you. Read the instructions for how to use the 2 bedpans you will find in the train. During the day, you must ensure the beds stay clean and help the patients get up and stretch their limbs every few hours. To Amy, Tina, and Yuyan, the professor had requested that they also become full-time nurses until the firefighters recovered. 2 patients will be coming back with the next trainload, Kenzie read. Uncle Louis is recovering, but will need a little longer. Cheers from the others interrupted him momentarily. This was encouraging news. Uncle Louis was still alive. He would be coming back. With a smile of relief, the young man wiped his eyes and continued. There will be sterile wipes, antibiotics, special wonder drink, and painkiller. Be very diligent to read the labels and measure quantities exactly. More instructions will follow. Read them carefully. Looking up, Kenzie directed his listeners. All right, everyone, let's get things set up before they return. This is an emergency. We need to act quickly. The tired crew flew back into action. At least everyone that heard the message got moving. Odin was still nowhere to be seen. The young man found the foam mattresses on the train. Piles of blankets, gauze cloths, bandages, and towels were neatly piled inside each car. Use my room, Amy called out to Kenzie as the guys set the first mattress on a large carry cart. It's the biggest and has the best view. I'm happy to make it part of the carrying center. Mine too, Georgia piped up with a resentful tone as she pulled a bundle of gauze out of the train. She wasn't happy that she had been overlooked as a potential caregiver. Damien tried to get up and help, but nearly fainted on Tina. Kenzie told him to rest and promised a stretcher ride. Franz and Lima looked over wearily and decided they were quite happy to wait for a lift as well. With 7 carts full of supplies, many of the tinies carried the beds, bandages, and bedding up Rainbow Hill. On the other side of the glass, Farouk arrived in the biome with large containers of medication that had to be distributed into small bottles for the carrying center. Evan and Jack set to work filling those flasks and labeling them carefully. With her small pipette, Rachel administered the first doses of antibiotics and the specialized protein formula that Dr. Montgomery had formulated for burn victims. Taking some antibacterial ointment, she also carefully dropped it onto their wounded limbs, but she avoided Zahir's face, worrying the liquid might seep into his mouth. Then she sterilized her small instrument and put it on the train. Once the final list of instructions had been written and the medications filled, Jax gazed into paradise. He was pleased to see that all the supplies had been taken off the train and the tinies were now coming back down Rainbow Hill. Nodding in approval, he was glad that so many had sensed the urgency and worked together to prepare the carrying center. Pressing the reverse button, he brought the train back to the supply room. Carefully, Zahir and Ponsi were placed in the cars, still lying on stretchers, and drugged into a deep sleep. In the last car, Jax placed the medications and instructions that Rachel had meticulously listed out. Sending the train back in, the 4 big humans gathered in the viewing hall to watch the transfer of care take place. How they hoped that everything would go well for the sake of their patients and for those who had been entrusted to their new and very important roles. How will they cope with suffering? Evan wondered to himself. Amy was the first to spot the train coming in. She called out to Kenzie and they sprinted across the meadow. Reaching the train shortly after it had stopped in front of the store, they yanked the first door open. The copper-haired nurse was elated to see that 2 patients had been returned. "You're back!" she cried out with relief. However, neither young man responded. "Let's find the note first," Kenzie reminded her. "We need to know what to do." Very concerned about the lack of response, Amy reached out for Zahir's hand, but he was sound asleep. His hand was limp. "Are they okay?" she questioned fearfully. "What happened to them?" Finding the handwritten message, Kenzie grabbed it quickly. He glanced over at Zahir with a worried expression and then began reading out loud. "Both patients have been sedated to help them deal with the pain," he read. "They will be asleep until the medication wears off." He sighed with deep relief, and so did Amy. The others had now reached the train and were crowding around. "I want to be a caregiver too," Georgia insisted, pushing forward to the front. "Zahir will be in my room and I will be his nurse." "And I'll look after Ponsi," Lily added. Ignoring their demands, Kenzie continued reading the instructions. The burns were to be cleaned gently with sterile wipes and bandaged with clean gauze and antibacterial ointment. There were 3 bottles of liquid in specific amounts and timing for each dose. There were details concerning life-threatening infection and fever, dangerous symptoms to watch for, the importance of hand washing, and how to tell time on the new clock. Notebooks and paper had been provided so they could write daily journals for each patient. Those notes were to be put on the train every day. And then the message clearly reiterated who would perform the various duties. There were to be 5 nurses, Amy, Tina, Yuyan, Kenzie, and Vahid. Kitchen and gardening duties would be shared by Georgia, Santa, Charlie, Nancy, Vinitha, and Lily, who were also to bring food to all the workers in the caring center. Tina, Yuyan, and Dia were to help wash and repair the patient's clothing and blankets. Bold words stated, "Everyone must shower before entering the caring center at any time. Extra towels are on the train." As the young man with the brown curly hair continued to read, Georgia argued, "I don't care what it says. I'm staying with Sahir." "And I can't leave Ponzi," Lily insisted. Neither of them were used to being told what they could and couldn't do. Kenzie glared in their direction. "For the next week, at least, all of us will follow these instructions exactly." Pointing to the words near the end of the message, he stated firmly, "Look, right here. The professor has said that both of you, and even Vinitha and Santa, can bring books to read to the patients every morning after breakfast. You can visit all you want when you're finished helping with the gardening and food preparation. Just remember to shower first." Georgia grumbled to herself and shrugged her shoulders. "I also don't know how to cook," she complained, "so why would I be sent to the kitchen? That's Amy's job. This is so dumb." Looking around, Kenzie ignored her complaints and asked, "Has anyone seen Odin?" No one had. "There are instructions for him as well," the tall, freckled young man muttered. "But for now, let's get these guys up to their beds. We have a lot to do." Just in case Odin was nearby, Amy spoke loudly. "I sure wish Odin would show up. We really could use his help with these stretchers." In a few minutes, a shame-faced Odin came hesitantly into view. His hair and beard were disheveled, and he looked fairly wild. Did you say you need help?" he asked awkwardly. He was met with angry stares from everyone. "You rollin' tumbler!" Damien shouted savagely from where he sat with Tina. He punched the air with his fist. "When are you going to stop destroying things? Look what you've done! Look at the damage! Look at the people that nearly lost their lives! If you ever do anything like this again, I'll drown you myself! I will!" Exhausted, his voice trailed off and he slumped back against the tree. Damien's angry outburst was frightening to everyone. Yet most felt that some sort of a rebuke was necessary. This was the second time Odin had put everyone's lives in danger. The flood and the fire had both been terrifying calamities. "We sure do need help," Tina snapped. "You've caused so many problems." "It's time you started making up for all you've done," Lima added harshly. "This was not just another dumb science experiment. Do it again and I'll help Damien put you under. And you too, Franz," he said, turning bitterly toward his surfing buddy, who had also suffered burns. "If you're going to follow Odin's crazy ideas, you'll get what he gets." For once, Odin wasn't defensive. "What do you want me to do?" he mumbled. "All of these brave, injured firefighters need to be carried up Rainbow Hill," Amy murmured, uncomfortable with the Beach Boys' terrible threats. She hoped Odin and France would try to make up for what they had done, and she knew that Ponzi was already paying a heavy price. "Let's get started with the ones who have the worst injuries," she suggested. "Kenzie and I will take Zahir. You and Vahid can take Ponzi." "I can help too," Georgia protested. "We need water," Kenzie told her brusquely. "If there isn't anything for you to do in the kitchen right now, please bring a few buckets of boiled water to the caring center." As Georgia reluctantly headed to the store, Amy struggled with her end of the stretcher. Seeing their need, Milan ran over to help. With his assistance, Amy and Kenzie began heading for Rainbow Hill. Charlie and Santa brought the supplies over in the carry carts. Tears ran down Amy's face as the limp bodies in the stretchers remained unresponsive to noise or jarring. She had never seen anyone sedated before, and it worried her. They looked nearly dead. She hoped she would be able to follow the instructions carefully enough There was a lot to remember. Eventually, one by one, all the injured were brought into the caring center and settled onto the brand new beds. Under Kenzie's direction, the most severely injured were taken to Amy's room and the others to George's. All the nurses showered, washed their hands with soap in the water that Georgia brought up, and then the work began. Taking charge, Kenzie directed Tina, Yu-Yan, and Vahid to start cleaning the Beach Boys' wounds, while he and Amy took on the others. Cleaning and dressing the wounds was not a pleasant task, but as the pain medication took effect, the hollers and complaints coming from George's room subsided. Partway through the process, Zahir and Ponzi began to flinch and groan. Thankfully, it was just in time for the caregivers to give their first round of medications. As Kenzie and Amy measured carefully to ensure that all 5 patients received their required dosages, Odin brought Zahir's gold chain up to the room. "Thank you so much," Amy said, as her eyes flew wide open, realizing she had left Zahir's precious treasure lying on the ground. She took it from Odin and hung it around the bedpost. Having not yet had a chance to share the instructions with everyone, Kenzie told the strong young man that he was to oversee cleaning up the mess in the burnt forest, hauling boiled water every day to the caring center, and carting new supplies and garbage back and forth to the train. Both were amazed that Odin didn't argue. Late that evening, when all the patients were finally clean, bandaged, and sleeping fitfully, Kenzie lay down wearily in the extra bed, following the professor's instructions for the male nurses. He had offered to do the first night of bedpan duty and be on call for help. Knowing that the patients would be well cared for, Amy was thankful to head to Lily's room. She would have preferred to be in with her best friend Santa, but Santa's room was only big enough for one. Deep breathing indicated her roommate was already asleep. Collapsing into bed, Amy didn't take long to join her. Chapter 3. Emergency Planning. Louis was sleeping soundly with an oxygen mask on his face and a monitor hooked up to record his vitals when Rachel, Evan, and the professor came down to the underground lab to check on him. 3 hectic hours had passed since he had been transported out of paradise on the train. Pleased with the stats on the monitor display, Rachel smiled. "I think he's going to make it," she said. "But his heart is damaged. He can't ever exert himself again." With a huge sigh of relief, the professor shook Dr. Khalid's small hand with both of his. "Merci beaucoup. I can't thank you enough, Rachel. The tinies aren't ready to lose Louis, and neither am I. I'm so appreciative." Evan shook her hand as well, saying, "And we're both very grateful for all the advice and supplies that you and your husband have sent in." "You're most welcome," Rachel acknowledged warmly as they headed toward the elevator. "But please do remember we've only made our best estimates on the proper dosages." With a look of concern, she straightened her white lab coat and cautioned, "None of us have worked with tiny humans before. Never. I'll check back tomorrow and ensure things are going smoothly." As the elevator brought them up to the next level, she reiterated the need for the nurses to take daily notes of the patients' activities and to record their temperatures. "If there are any spikes in temperature, loss of appetite, or consciousness, please call me immediately," she said. "I have a small thermometer that I will send in," the professor assured her. The elevator doors opened and they walked down the long corridor toward the train supply room. "We will pass everything we hear on to you. I can't thank you enough for helping us to organize this rescue mission." Entering the train supply room, Rachel nodded. "If your tinies are diligent and follow all the instructions carefully, the victims will do well in their care. Amy saved Louis's life, you know." Evan and the professor exchanged glances. Rachel had been the first to assess Louis when he came in unconscious on the train. She saved his life?" Evan stuttered. "Yes. Louis was breathing on his own when he came in. Her hands are just the right size. Her pressure was perfect. I might have broken his ribs with my thumb." Pointing to a bottle of the highly nutritious protein formula procured by her husband, Dr. Farouk Khalid, Rachel continued, "I can't stress enough how important this special formula is for those who are severely burned. In our world, this would be delivered intravenously, but obviously We have no miniature medical equipment. Ensure that your nurses encourage the patients to drink it every 2 hours during the day, whether they want it or not." Nodding, Evan jotted a quick note for the next page of instructions. They all walked into the viewing room and took one more look into the Paradise Dome. "I am concerned about Zahir and Ponzi," Rachel fretted, wringing her hands anxiously. "I'm so thankful we had them assessed properly. Dr. Montgomery is the best in his field." She looked up and pleaded, "However, the next 72 hours will be crucial. It may be best to remind your nurses to be extra cautious." "I will," Jax promised. Considering the uniqueness of the tinies, he added, "They may heal more rapidly than normal. Their cellular systems are generally in a fast-forward state since a full growth potential has been restricted." "Very true. It's all so unpredictable, isn't it?" she nodded, watching 3 tinies carry Damien across the meadow to the carrying center on the hill. "I feel for Zahir," she fretted. "His face will be quite physically scarred from this ordeal, if he survives. It's going to be hard on him. To think it was all because he wanted to save one of the arsonists." "If he survives?" Evan clarified anxiously. "Is his life in doubt?" "Your nurses are new to this," she replied. Turning to the professor, she asked, "Are you certain you've chosen the most caring, dedicated individuals? Will they follow the instructions thoroughly?" Jax nodded. He had no doubt about his 5 nurses. "Absolutely," he said. When can we send Louis back into the caring center?" Evan begged uncertainly. "They need his guidance in a crisis like this." Dr. Khalid nodded. "Your Louis needs solid bed rest for the next few weeks, but it would do him good to be with the other patients as soon as his vitals are steady. I can explain to him all the particulars for healing burns, so he will be able to guide the others. Louis will never be strong again, but he will heal faster, surrounded by people he loves. They all will." When the doctor left through the office door, Evan turned to the professor. "I'm so thankful Rachel is willing to help us." Nodding, the professor agreed. "She adores this project. I believe she and her husband will be watching over everything carefully." "That is quite fortunate for all the tinies," Evan exclaimed. Watching the 3 young men labor to get Damien up the hill, the professor remarked wistfully, "We won't be able to count on Louis anymore for cell phone communication." "No," Evan agreed. "He certainly won't be able to make any more trips to the cave if we send him to the caring center. What is your plan? Should we just keep sending messages back and forth on the train to whoever opens the door first?" With a serious expression, the professor replied, "I plan to ask Amy to take on the communications." "Why Amy?" Evan inquired curiously, folding his arms across his chest. He knew that she was special to the professor, but he wasn't exactly sure why. "Zahir, Kenzie, Santa, or even Tina would be equally responsible," he suggested. Then he corrected himself. I realize Zahir is injured at the moment, but Kenzie?" Observing the action inside the dome, Jax quietly watched Charlie, Milan, and Odin dash back to the charred forest for Lima. Finally, he replied, "I'd like to choose Amy. I've given this a lot of thought, and I want to work with her." "Okay. I'm sure she will do a fantastic job," Evan nodded. "Just like she is taking to nursing. Who would have thought?" With a light laugh, the professor acknowledged, "The reaction to the sight of blood is a great separator. When I saw those 5 tinies take charge of the victims in such a brave, compassionate way, I had no doubt who the nurses were. It's not for everyone, but some do excel." Evan smiled. "The others may miss Amy's cooking." "It takes talent to be a chef," the professor agreed. "Not everyone can make food magnifique, but most can make it edible. It's good for some of the others to learn how to cook." Pondering the professor's choice of Amy, Evan wondered if there might be something else motivating his decision. Amy certainly had some leadership qualities, but he didn't consider her to be the top choice. She was a sensitive, somewhat timid girl, and he wasn't sure she would always rise to the occasion when adversity set in, even though she had responded remarkably well to the medical crisis. An intriguing idea had been forming in Evan's mind ever since the professor had called out to Louis during the fire. "May I ask you something?" he said to the professor. "Of course, anything you like." You called out to Louis when he was hobbling over to help Zahir lift the catapult. You said, 'Not my son, not my aging son.'" Jax was watching Charlie, Milan, and Odin position the stretcher so that Lima could get on it. Santa was trying to help. Lima was hopping on one leg, and for a moment it looked like he might end up on the ground. After some tottering back and forth, the tall, dark youth fell onto the stretcher. Thankfully, Odin was able to keep his end up, or the fall might have hurt. Santa praised the stocky, wild-eyed youth and began walking with them towards the hill. With a furtive glance in Evan's direction, the professor hesitated to reply. "Is Louis actually your son?" Evan prodded. There was a very long pause and then a deep sigh. "Yes, he is," Jax admitted slowly. "When Wendy and I were attempting to have a family, we used IVF. There were plenty of embryos available to me without requiring consent forms from anyone else." For a moment, Evan was dazed. His suspicions were true. Is Amy also your daughter?" Tears welled up in Jack's eyes. "Oui," he nodded. The pieces of the puzzle were fitting together, but Evan was still curious. "Who else belongs to you?" he asked gently. Folding his arms across his chest, Jax confessed, "Franz is also my son." "What?" "I would never have guessed Franz," Evan remarked in astonishment. "The son of the famous scientist surfs all day and sleeps on the beach." Then Evan thought carefully. "Although Franz has shown some clever ingenuity when he applies himself," he conceded. "That ball slinger was exceptionally well made." Jax nodded. "He has some skills, but Franz is definitely not someone that I would ask to lead Paradise." Trying to ensure that he had it all worked out, Evan clarified, "So Louis, Amy, and Franz are yours." "Ah, the Europeans," he smiled, remembering how the professor had once labeled them. "No one else?" "No one else," the professor promised. They watched as Lima was taken across the meadow. Santa held his hand all the way. She helped with the stretcher once they reached the hill. Now that he fully understood the relationship dynamics, Evan clarified, "So you want to choose Amy because she is your daughter?" Jack shook his head fervently. Non, Evan, that's not all there is to it. Amy has lovely qualities that I feel I can work with." Nodding his head, Evan didn't push the matter further, but he was concerned that the professor was becoming partial. How could he not? Of course he would want to choose his own daughter. "I really hope I'm not biased," the professor lamented, knowing it would be against his own principles and suddenly second-guessing himself. "But I genuinely see in Amy a kind heart and a willingness to put others first. She's a lot like her mother." Evan glanced over compassionately. He understood. He tried to determine how they would proceed with reinstating communication on the new phone in the cave, asking, "How will you tell Amy about this?" Looking into the dome, the professor replied, "I'll write a private message to her and send it in tomorrow." Nodding slowly, Evan wondered how it would all work. Between becoming a nurse and learning how to use a smartphone, Amy had a steep learning curve ahead. Chapter 4. A Conversation in the Lab. Lying alone in the peaceful, dark chamber, Louis felt very comfortable. Oxygen was flowing freely through the mask on his face. He could see the monitor on the wall beeping softly in a regular pattern as it kept track of his heartbeat. The blankets were satiny smooth, and he felt like he could sleep forever. "How long have I been here?" he wondered wearily. A new noise startled him. He opened his eyes and realized that the professor was sitting on a makeshift bed beside him. "You're awake!" the professor rejoiced, happy to talk to his son before going to sleep for the night. "How are you feeling, Louis?" Jax was sitting close to the tiny elevated emergency chamber that had been prepared for such a time as this. There had only been a few times in their lives that they had seen each other without a glass enclosure between them. Unable to reply with the mask on his face, Louis motioned with a thumbs up. The professor reached over and placed his hand beside the tiny. With a smile, his aging son clasped the finger closest to him. It felt like a hug. "Thank you for saving Ponzi and Zahir," Jack smiled as tears welled up in his eyes. "I would never have asked you to risk your life like that. Ça allures, you were very brave to run in there, especially in your condition. So thankful that you didn't lose your life." Louis looked at him thoughtfully. Even though he was unable to speak, the professor could tell by his son's wrinkled forehead that he was thinking deeply. While the elder Tiny appreciated the professor's protective sentiments, he wondered how he would have felt if Zahir and Ponzi had died in the fire. Weren't 2 lives worth the risk of 1? Moving a hand in a questioning fashion and shrugging his shoulders, Louis longed to ask about the fire. He remembered seeing the girls running towards him, but nothing after that. "Do you want to know what happened?" Jax inquired. Louis nodded. "You had a heart attack," the professor explained. "But Amy knew what to do. You taught her well. She brought you back to life with the CPR training you gave her. The boys put you on the train and we stabilized you once you came down here. Your heart is quite weak, but you're alive, and I'm so thankful. I love you, Louis." Stroking the big finger, Louis tried to express his deep feelings without words. "Amy saved me," he thought with astonishment. He remembered back to the day he had taught first aid, recalling how eager she was to learn. He was so pleased she had succeeded, for her sake and for his. Then he thought about the terrible burns 2 tinies had incurred and wondered how they were doing. With great anxiety, he weakly raised one arm and drew a Z, then a P in the air. It took a moment or two for Jax to understand. Finally, he smiled. "Ah, you're asking what happened to Zahir and Ponzi." Louis nodded earnestly. The professor told them they had very serious burns, but he was hopeful that with the right care and medication, they would recover well. He explained they had set up a caring center in the girls' mansion, and the doctors had given him a lot of medical advice and assistance. "I've put Amy, Tina, and Yuyan in charge of nursing them back to health during the day," he relayed. "Kenzie and Vahid are doing the night shift and bedpan duties. We'd like to send you back into paradise as soon as you are stable. However, you will need to be on complete bed rest for at least 3 weeks. With a frown, Louis wondered how he would endure 3 weeks in bed with nothing to do. He wouldn't be able to continue his research on the Bible. But the professor was insistent that complete rest was necessary. "We'll recommend you go into the same room as Zahir and Ponzi," he informed him. "The medical instructions we've sent in must be followed exactly, and the medications given just as prescribed. Their temperatures and wounds must be carefully monitored. If not, infection could set in quickly. They aren't out of danger yet, and the next 3 days will be crucial. We considered keeping them here on our side, but their wounds are too fragile. The doctors feel that tiny hands will give better care than we can." Louis nodded. With all his heart, he wanted to ensure the young men recovered. He longed to be with them, helping Amy, Tina, and Yuyan make the best decisions concerning their care. "Rest now," the professor encouraged. "We'll send you back in tomorrow morning if your heart remains stable." With a thankful nod, Louis agreed. Tears welled up in his eyes as he considered that Zahir and Ponzi were still in danger. Jack saw the tears. "Their situation is troubling," he assured him, "but we have the best doctors overseeing their care. If you are in there monitoring the situation, I feel very confident that full recovery is possible." With a smile, he added his hopeful thoughts that due to the tinies' rapid self-reproduction, they might heal faster than normal. For a moment, the two sat together in thoughtful silence. Louis gently rubbed the professor's finger as he pondered what lay ahead. He desperately hoped the nurses were taking good care of their patients. "There's one more thing I want to say to you, Louis," Jax relayed quietly. "Since you will be confined to bed, I'm going to ask Amy to take on the communications with me. I will send a private letter in for her with written instructions, but she may need your guidance to work it all out." Louis nodded slowly. He was pleased that Amy had been chosen, but wondered why she had been singled out. Feeling that there were at least 3 other tinies that were quite capable of handling the position, he motioned Z, K, S? The professor didn't immediately understand what Louis was trying to say. After 3 tries, he nodded. Yes, those would all be good choices, and Evan agrees with you. Eventually, Amy will need someone else to support her and balance her decisions, but right now she seems rather alone. I think it will be best to have a male and a female with a strong friendship to interact with me. He paused and then asked, do you think that maybe Zahir would be a good choice to help her? Last week I overheard the beautiful song they sang together. Have they reconciled? Looking up with consternation, Louis shook his head. He had been privy to Zahir's outpouring of grief the day after the song, and he knew that the sensitive, dark-haired young man was fully committed to Georgia. Louis felt that if he and Amy were given a secret mission, this would be terribly upsetting to Georgia and emotionally disconcerting to Zahir. Having his own personal thoughts on the matter, Louis drew a K in the air. Kenzie? The professor deliberated. He had his heart set on Amy and Zahir for a number of reasons. Thinking it through, he pondered, perhaps I have it all wrong. I've certainly been wrong about many things with this experiment. Am I completely biased? Louis has a much better idea of the relationship dynamics. He witnesses the personal interactions. Why have I been so set on Zahir? Is it only because he reminds me of a good friend? Reluctantly, he acknowledged to himself, Kenzie is certainly capable of sincere, compassionate leadership. He would be a very good choice. And the Tinies must have free will, he reminded himself with a sigh. I can't force things to happen, or I will be going against my own principles. Louis patted his finger affectionately. Maybe you're right, Jacques acknowledged reluctantly. You know the Tinies best. For now, I'm thankful that Amy can turn to you for help. In the peaceful, darkened room, with soft beeps and fluttering lights, there was one more thing that Jacques wanted to tell Louis face to face. While they had this private opportunity, there was something he wanted to say. You're probably wondering why I've chosen Amy, he asked. Louis nodded. Well, first of all, she is a loving, thoughtful person, much like you, he smiled warmly. She wants to do good, and she cares about choosing right over wrong. She trusts me. Those are the most important reasons, and without those qualities, nothing else would matter. But there is something else I want you to know. You and Amy are both my real children, he said, happily sharing the secret which he had often alluded to but never fully revealed. You have the same mother and the same father. Amy is your sister, even though you are many months apart. I loved your mother dearly. She was a very special person. If you had lived here in my world, Louis, you and Amy would have grown up together in my family. The heart monitor beeped erratically and warning lights flashed. Worried, Jacques looked over. Within 10 seconds, the monitor sign settled back down. He didn't tell Louis about Franz. In his son's fragile state, he only wanted to share a little joy. Tears welled up in Louis's eyes. He had always thought of the professor as a father figure, but it was heartwarming to know that he truly was his son. And while he loved all the Tinies that the professor had placed in his care, there had always been a special connection between himself and Amy. She's my sister, he considered radiantly. I have a real sister in paradise. I can't wait to tell her. He looked up at Jacques with a puzzled expression, wondering if he were free to share this news. He also wished he could take off the oxygen mask so they could have an actual conversation. You can tell her, Jacques smiled, anticipating Louis's thoughts. Make sure she understands that I consider all the Tinies my children. I love you all. This relationship doesn't give her any special status, he cautioned, except the privilege to communicate with me. Tell her that I am looking forward to speaking with her on the phone. With a happy smile, he added, and please tell Amy that I love her. Louis nodded eagerly, longing to witness the new family interactions. I'm so thankful that I lived to be part of this, he thought, with a grateful prayer upwards. Still exhausted, his eyes began to close. You're tired, the professor acknowledged, nudging Louis gently with his finger. He showed him a small button by the bed. This is for emergencies, he explained. I'll be sleeping here beside you tonight. If you wake up in the morning and I'm not here, you can always press this button and I'll come immediately. Holding up the slim black device he now rarely forgot, he said, The heart monitor is linked to my phone." Lifting his hand from Louis's side, the gray-haired researcher was about to lie down on his cot, but then he felt there was one more thing he had to say. "If I don't get another chance to speak to you privately," Jax begged, "please do your best to guide Amy to choose her partner carefully. He must be loving and caring and have servant leadership qualities. I trust you, Louis, to work this out. I don't want to force anyone together, but please provide encouragement if she asks you for advice." Wearily, Louis nodded. As he and the professor drifted off to sleep in the dark, peaceful room, he thought to himself, "I'll do my best to guide Amy to find a good partner, but I will not force anything. They all need genuine relationships of their own choosing in order to feel truly loved and appreciated for who they are. At least, that's what I would want if I had the choice." However, he reflected dreamily as he thought about the professor's failed attempt to give him a partner, "I'm sure I would have enjoyed Loretta, whoever she was. It would have been really nice to have had a wife." Chapter 5. Louis's Request. Jax met Evan at 8 the next morning in the Paradise Room. He was tired. Sleeping on the cot beside Louis hadn't been the most restful experience. With all the soft beeps on the monitor and his anxiety over what might be happening in the caring center, Professor Lemans was feeling quite stressed. However, exams were over, and he knew he might never run them again. His teaching career was likely to be terminated based on the decisions made by the ethics committee, and the university was now shut down for the summer break. All the scientists that had come to tour Paradise had gone home with plenty to discuss. He and Evan were both thankful they had a break in duties while so much was at stake in the dome. Walking over to look into the enormous terrarium with his assistant, the professor noted that very few were outside. Charlie, Lima, and Santa were watering the gardens, and Odin was dragging burnt trees from the front of the forest to the back. Plenty of activity could be heard coming from the store as the Tinies came in and out for breakfast. Sadly, he could also hear moans and cries coming from the girls' mansion. "They must be changing the dressings," Evan sighed sorrowfully. "I feel so sorry for the burn victims." "Yes, there is a lot of pain and suffering right now in the caring center," the professor agreed sadly. "Zahir and Ponzi must be in absolute agony. I hope the nurses read all of Dr. Khalid's instructions," he fretted. "As Rachel said, the next few days will be vital." "Do you think Amy will figure out how to communicate with us?" Evan asked. Reaching into his lab coat, the professor pulled out his phone. "I know how we can help her," he smiled. "How about we make a video? You can tell her what to do with a demonstration on your cell phone. Then we just have to explain in our note how to get into the cave, turn on the device, and press the white dove app." Noticing the professor was positioning his phone to take a video, Evan smiled. "Now?" "This is just as good a time as any," the professor nodded. It took 2 tries, but a video was made and sent off to the control cave phone. Jack sat down and wrote a little note to his daughter. Rachel knocked at the door and delivered a small eyedropper bottle with a special concoction from Farouk for Louis's recovery. It was well labeled with clear instructions in a very small font. "I just had a good visit with Louis," she told them. As she and Evan loaded the bottle onto the train, along with another supply of downsized gauze strips, a few more mattress covers, and the tiny thermometer that Jax had found, she relayed, "I've explained everything he needs to know about burns." Looking over at the professor, who had just finished his note, Rachel added, "Jax, when you have a chance this morning, could you please come and have a look at the boa constrictor? I think it swallowed some litter. Maybe someone threw garbage into the pond. I need help to get it down from the tree." Jax raced off to have a look while Evan finished packing the train. He put the professor's note into a tiny brown envelope to send in with Louis. Once he was done, he decided to check again on the very important patient in the basement laboratory. Louis was awake and looking around. "Glad to see your eyes are open," Evan smiled kindly. "You're looking well." Gazing up at the tall young man with the spiky blonde hair, Louis's eyes brightened happily above his oxygen mask. He had been thinking hard about an urgent matter which he found difficult to mention to his father the night before. With one arm in the air, Louis made a typing motion with his finger. Evan studied his actions with a frown, and then finally understood. "You want to write a message?" he smiled. Taking out his phone and wiping it carefully with disinfectant, Evan opened the notepad app and held it in front of Louis. With a happy nod, Louis quickly typed a few sentences. "Evan, do you have any thoughts about God or Jesus? Are they real? Have you read God's book?" When Evan looked at the message, he was thoroughly astonished. Running his hand through his hair and causing it to stand straight up in a spiky fashion, he thought about how he and Seth had discussed sharing the gospel message with the Tinies only a week ago. He remembered Seth's prayer. At the time, Evan felt it was impossible to take a missionary initiative without going behind the professor's back. The whole idea seemed preposterous. He had never imagined that Louis would ask him these questions, especially not after the older Tiny had read the professor's book, Faith or Fact, An End to Delusion. With an uneasy glance in Louis's direction, Evan was struck by his earnest gaze. The elder Tiny's hands were tight together as though he were begging for an answer. "I haven't always known about God," the young researcher replied hesitantly, keeping things sterile and positioning the phone in front of Louis again. "But I've been learning about him. I've been finding more reasons to believe he exists than to believe that he doesn't. I have read some of his book." Louis's eyes filled with relief and joy. He typed on the screen. "I learned about God on the internet. I started to read his book weeks before the fire, but I didn't get far. Evan, I prayed to him to give me more time, and I'm still alive. I survived a heart attack and a fire. I believe God has extended my life. If I'm going to be confined to bed, I'll have so much time to read, but no opportunity to get to the cave. Please, is there some way you can help me continue my research?" Reading the message, Evan felt his spine tingle with excitement and apprehension. This was an opportunity like no other to send the gospel message into paradise. Yet he felt unsure whether he should go against the professor. He knew Jax would be furious if he sent in a Bible. Glancing up from his phone, he was moved by Louis's pleading eyes. "You know how the professor feels about the Bible and God, right?" Evan inquired nervously. "I know you have read the professor's book." Louis nodded and moved his fingers in a typing motion. When Evan repositioned the phone, he typed, "Life matters to me, Evan. I don't have much of it left, maybe a few weeks, but not likely months. I'm desperate to find out if there's anything more. I believe the Bible offers a hope that is beyond anything the professor can give. I love Jesus and his extraordinary teachings which go far beyond servant leadership. I want to read more about him. I believe that God heard my prayers and gave me this extra time to investigate. Please, Evan, is there some way you can help? Can you print out some of the pages of the Bible and send them in on the train every day?" Evan pondered the matter thoughtfully. "I could send you in a complete copy," he murmured anxiously, remembering that Seth had one that he was willing to lend. "Only I feel the professor would never forgive me, and I don't know for certain that the Bible is true or reliable. But it is very intriguing." Louis's eyes opened wide. "You have a small copy?" he wrote. Evan nodded. "My friend has one that he's willing to share." Typing on the phone, Louis said, "Evan, please send this book to me." "Tell you what," Evan replied decisively. "Send a message to the professor and ask him if you can have a copy of the Bible. Beg him to allow you the opportunity to investigate," Evan chuckled. "And use the word investigate," he emphasized. "Any true scientist appreciates the necessity of a full and fair investigation." Louis wasted no time in finding the professor's name in the White Dove app on Evan's phone. Assuming that his relationship with the professor was still unknown to Evan, he didn't begin his message with "Father" as he would have liked. Instead, he typed in, "Dear Professor, I would really like to do a thorough investigation on the Bible. I have read your book, and I would also like to read God's. I don't have much time left to live, and I want to be sure I have fully examined the evidence on both sides of this argument before coming to my own conclusion. Please allow me this vital opportunity to investigate while I am confined to bed. With much love, Louis." Looking up at Evan, the eldest Tiny pressed the send button. Together they anxiously waited to see what the response would be. Minutes dragged by. To pass the time, Evan told Louis about various happenings in paradise that day. "You'll be pleased to know that Odin worked all day on the rock stairway for Rainbow Hill," Evan said. "It's more than halfway done." Louis looked astonished, thinking, Odin is working without supervision? "And on his own initiative," Evan added. "He has also been carrying water back and forth without complaint, like we asked him to. He apologized outside at dinner last night for all the damage he caused, and even helped to unload the train this morning." Wide-eyed, Louis was hopeful for change. "And there are a new group of kitchen helpers," Evan explained. "Georgia and Lily have been asked to collect the food from the garden every day and help Nancy and Milan to prepare it. Feeding everyone will be more complicated as there are so many deliveries that need to be made to the caring center, but those who weren't injured are readily volunteering to help." The lab door creaked open, and footsteps sounded in the hall. The professor came around the corner with a baffled expression. He had his phone in his hand. "Louis," he said, addressing the tiny in the small white bed, "I am astonished at your request. This isn't the time to fill your head with, nonsense. If you feel you only have a short time left, you should spend it talking to the other tinies and encouraging them to carry on in the wonderful, loving manner you have shown." Evan could see the look of deep disappointment on Louis's face. He felt Louis was quite disadvantaged with the oxygen mask on his face, unable to speak. "Jax," Evan spoke up in his defense, "Louis began this research before the fire, but his time was cut short. He longs to finish his research and determine for himself what is right and wrong and where hope lies. I suggest we allow him to do this investigation in a full and fair way. Louis has rarely requested anything for himself." Holding his own phone up for the mastermind of paradise to view, Evan said, "Read what Louis wrote to me." Folding his arms across his chest, Jax read Louis's pleas on Evan's phone. He tingled with alarm. Looking at the two earnest faces staring at him, he was distressed that they both thought this was a good idea. "Evan," the professor reasoned, "if Louis were to stay here on our side, I would readily allow him this opportunity to research whatever he wanted. But taking a Bible into paradise will potentially cause confusion among the tinies. They only have a short lifespan to sort anything out. It has taken me years of scientific study and careful analysis to come to the conclusion that God is just a foolish fantasy created by humans to control other humans. I don't want to see this concept brought into paradise. It will throw everything into chaos. I can't allow this." Pacing back and forth, Evan felt his mentor's reasoning was unfair. "In class, you have always promoted the importance of investigating both sides of a matter," he reminded him. "You say we should consider all the evidence before drawing our own conclusions. You warn your students about the dangers of bias and demonstrate how many times bias has skewed the results of crucial experiments. On top of all that, you are against rules and restrictions in paradise. So how can you ban the Bible?" "Because it has been proven wrong? Because it is archaic? Because it promotes false hopes and ideas? I feel I must make an exception to my principles. The Bible cannot go into paradise." "Proven wrong?" Evan frowned. "By whom?" "Evan, there is no God," the professor protested. "How can an intelligent person like you let Seth fill your head with all this foolish nonsense? It is very evident there is no one looking after us when we see the lack of protection for those on our planet. The Bible itself is riddled with contradictions and error. There are thousands of discrepancies between the manuscripts that have been found. The promises that God made have not occurred. Think of all the predictions that Christians have made over the last 100 years that God will intervene and Jesus Christ will return. None of them have happened. With all the disease, pestilence, wars, potential for a nuclear annihilation, natural catastrophes, and climate change, we will either blow ourselves up or pollution and disease will snuff out life." Lying back, observing the discussion, Louis was distressed to hear the bitterness in his father's voice. He had read rather accusatory words in his book, Faith or Fact, but now he heard the tone. He wondered if such intense emotions might have hampered his father's ability to be objective. But why, he thought, why is he bitter? And are there really thousands of contradictions, he wondered anxiously? That would certainly deal a serious blow to the reliability of the record. And if promises have not been kept, That would indicate the book may be a fraud. But Jax, you're overlooking many promises which God made that have occurred, Evan pleaded. Seth is still confident that Jesus will return to save the world and restore God's creation. It just hasn't happened yet. What promises have been fulfilled? Well, for instance, from the beginning of creation, God promised to send the Messiah. He gave hundreds of details in the Old Testament about him, of which the majority were realized when Jesus Christ came to earth the first time. Some remain as promises for the future, the last day. But that's all part of the book itself, Jax pointed out. Of course the Bible is going to tell you that its prophecies came true. How do we know Jesus really existed, apart from the Holy Book? I guess I'll need to ask Seth about that, Evan replied, not being entirely sure himself. Undaunted, he chose an example that he had researched. As Seth told us, God promised to bring the Jewish people back to the land of Israel from all over the earth and make them a nation again in their own land. That happened against all odds in the last 100 years. The professor was shaking his head in disbelief. Having spent hours looking at passages from Ezekiel and Zechariah with the Bible study group that Seth attended, Evan gestured with his hands in a pleading way. Think how small Israel is compared to the numerous hostile nations all around them, who continuously rally for their destruction. God promised that the Jews' neglected land would once again be productive and that they would dwell on the mountains of Israel, the disputed West Bank. We are seeing it happen before our eyes. Lors, do you realize you are condoning the oppressive and illegal takeover of Palestinian land? That may be how the media spins it, Evan acknowledged, but not how the Bible portrays it, or even the unbiased historical records. Responding to the skeptical look on the professor's face, Evan continued, Professor Lemans, none of this has happened easily. Israel's had a daily struggle against the human forces that openly threaten its existence on many sides. Without God fulfilling his promise to the Jewish people, there would be no nation of Israel today. It is a real miracle, and more is still to come. Sadly, the Bible indicates that more destruction will come before the greatest miracle ever. Lying comfortably in his bed, Louis found the open discussion helpful in determining his own viewpoint. He hoped that he could research the miracle of Israel returning to their land, the thousands of discrepancies, and some other things that he had come across in his previous investigation. Desperately curious, he made motions to type on the phone. He had rarely, if ever, argued against his father, but he felt he must insist on doing this research. If the Bible were true, he knew from what he'd already read that lives were at stake in a much greater way than the professor acknowledged. Both researchers heard Louis's heart rate go up on the monitor and turned to him. Evan noticed he was motioning to type and passed him his phone. While Louis was entering his message, Evan kindly asked, If Louis believes the Bible is true and yet it isn't, what will happen? Well, the professor muttered, he'll die believing a lie. Like the hope that you can restore life to the cells and bring Rosa back? Evan prodded. Instantly he grimaced as he saw the professor flinch. I'm sorry, Jax, he apologized, placing his hand on the older man's shoulder. That was uncalled for. Walking away and pacing around the room, the senior scientist didn't meet Evan's eyes. In a more conciliatory tone, Evan continued, If God is real, and Louis dies with a hope for the future, what has he gained? Shaking his head, the professor didn't want to answer the question. Quietly, Evan gave his own reply. What he gains is the hope of resurrection from the dead. If the Bible is true, then Louis gains God's salvation and the hope of living forever. Why wouldn't we allow him the opportunity to make this choice for himself? 6 years hardly compares to a promise of eternity. With the heart monitor still beeping quite fast, Louis finished his message and pressed send. Receiving the text instantly, the professor read, I love paradise. I love every tiny that you've put in my care. I dearly long to be with them and help them through this crisis, but this research means more to me than even my own life. If I'm only allowed to research on this side of paradise, then I beg to stay here for another week and finish my investigation. Please may I have access to the internet somehow. Perhaps you could put me in the nursery. However, if you allow me to take a copy of the Bible into paradise, I will only share it with those who are with me in crisis care. Zahir, Ponsi, and whichever nurses remain with them in the evenings. We will keep our investigation private while we try to determine what is right and what is wrong. I will also share the book that you wrote with them if you make it available to me in a small format. You must remember that it is very easy to find God's book online. Potential leaders in paradise will certainly come across it. It will be better for the future of everyone that the leaders have opportunity to discuss the options thoroughly and make our own conclusions as a group. With a heavy heart, the professor pondered the message. It wasn't like Louis to make insistent demands. He saw the desperation in his son's eyes. Fearfully, he wondered what would happen to Zahir and Ponzi if Louis didn't return for a week. The next 3 days were critical, and he was counting on Louis to oversee the healthcare providers and coach the new nurses through the dangerous infection that could soon set in. He knew Louis longed to take part in the recovery process and was not likely to cast this opportunity aside unless he felt something drastically more important was at stake. Was finding a hope for the future so crucial that Louis would give up everything else that mattered? As Jacques quietly deliberated his decision, he realized that his son had raised a good point. Amy is likely to come across the Bible online someday, he acknowledged. Without Louis to help her sort through what she reads, she may be turned against me. He's promised to read both books to the Tinies. Surely truth will prevail. Turning to the eldest Tiny, he said evenly, "You may have a Bible in paradise." He looked over at Evan. "I assume you have this copy?" "I can get it," Evan nodded. "And I will find a way to make a small copy of my book," Jacques relayed to Louis, "so you can lead the investigation fairly. However, I would like you to carefully minimize the number of Tinies who are involved with you in the room. Amy and Zahir should both be there," he insisted. "And Ponzi, of course," he added. Since Louis felt Kenzie was the best choice, he granted his attendance as well. Then he begged, "But please do not invite anyone else until the 5 of you have reached a consensus on the matter." Louis nodded gratefully. "When do I go home?" he typed. "I'm ready to go." Jack's phone rang. Looking at the screen, he saw that it was Tom Freeman from Canadian Broadcasting calling to request an interview. He had already left a voice message that morning, and there were at least 6 unanswered emails. "Today," Jacques assured his son, before dashing off to the elevator to take the call in private. Once inside the enclosure, he answered the phone. Tom chided him for his lack of response. "You promised a full disclosure once Paradise was open to the public," he reminded him. "I assume that will be happening in the next few weeks as planned? Even though I hear you had another catastrophe. I hope everything is okay. When should I schedule you for an interview?" With a sigh, the professor felt very weary. "Listen, Tom," he pleaded. "Paradise has gone through enormous upheaval in the last 2 months. To be honest, it hasn't gone according to plan. I'm not really sure what to make of it all. I don't know what I'd say in an interview." "You could say exactly what you just said," Tom laughed. "After all, everyone only wants to hear the truth. I should just mention," he remarked in a serious tone, "that the very graphic video of the fire will be airing on TV tomorrow night, and it's going viral on social media. There will be a huge public outcry for information. Everyone will want to know how this disaster is being handled and how you intend to avoid such a dangerous situation occurring in the future. It is essential for you to keep the public informed." "I'll send daily reports," Jack promised. "But please give me another month before requesting an interview. I feel I'll have a better understanding by then. I'd like to have answers for you, but I'm just not prepared at this point to go public with any of my opinions." "It's that bad, eh?" Tom goaded. "It's just not what I expected," the professor replied. "A disappointment?" "In some ways, yes," the professor admitted. "In other ways, no. I feel I'm gaining some important insights from this experiment, but I'm just not ready to make any conclusions yet." "Ha! This bodes well for the future," Tom chuckled. "The professor has learned something new. I'll call you again in a month and see what we can set up." "In a month, then," the professor agreed with a sigh, wondering if he should have asked for a year.